Hey everyone, my name is Kaz and I'm one of the co-founders of MDFF. Welcome to tonight's screening of Fausto and Ante Mis Ojos. To begin, we'd like to acknowledge that tonight's event is taking place in the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of New Credit and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, and our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and TIFF Cinematheque's public supporters, the Ontario Media Development Corporation, and the Canada Council for the Arts. As a charitable organization, we'd also like to thank our donors and members for making TIFF's year-round programming and educational and community outreach initiatives possible. So this is the last screening of our winter MDFF season. Our new lineup will be announced soon for spring. I won't go through the whole lineup, but I'll just announce our first screening, which is going to be the latest from Simon Liang. We're going to host the Toronto premiere of Your Face next month in May. But yeah, as for tonight's film, we have the pleasure of having two incredible Canadian filmmakers who both have made films set in Central and South America. We'll be screening Ante Mis Ojos by Lina Rodriguez first, and then Andrea Bussmann's Fausto. I'm going to invite them both up to say hello, but first I'll just do a little intro for each of them. Lina has directed 2 feature films and a number of shorts. Her first feature, Señoritas, had its world premiere at the Cartagena International Film Festival and played here at the Lightbox in 2014. And her follow-up feature, This Time Tomorrow, had its world premiere at the Locarno Film Festival in 2016. Ante Mis Ojos is shot on grainy, amber-like Super 8mm film. Lina's elusive and evocative film offers a fragmentary glimpse of Colombia's mythic Lake Guatavita, long considered the inspiration for the legend of El Dorado. And then Fausto, the feature film that we're screening tonight. This is Andrea Bussmann's first solo feature. She previously co-directed Tales of Two Who Dreamt with Nicholas Preda, which premiered at the Berlinale in 2016. It was also the opening night film of Images 2 years ago, which is also happening tonight at the Row. Tales was a mixture of observational documentary and a portrait of a Roma refugee family living in Parkdale. The film takes some inspiration from literature and has a very Kafka-esque fairy tale quality, while also being influenced by Borges' work with translation. But for tonight's feature, as you may have guessed, it also has some literary influences. Fausto is obviously based on the German myth legend of Faust. But Bussmann's interest is less based on story elements, but rather formal and thematic qualities. The film's not only based on Goethe's Faust, but takes cues from various adaptations by Gertrude Stein, Marlowe, and Mahler. These different adaptations lead to questions about technology and perception. The film's set on the Oaxacan coast of Mexico, and is a film that looks at different evolving cinematic technologies, but also their relationship to nature and perception. Themes also emerge from its Mexican setting and post-colonial issues that commingle with the anti-empiricist issues found in the text of Faust. But yeah, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lina and Andrea.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight. When you could have been at the Images, which would be great to do the after party after. I'm not going to say too much about the film. I will let you watch it and interpret it, and then be here for questions. And yeah, not much else. Thanks, Cats, for having us. And you.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited that you're going to get to see our films together. I think, as Cass said, I shot my film in Lake Guatavita, which is in Bogota in Colombia. It's supposed to be where the legend of El Dorado started. I shot in Super 8, and perhaps I don't want to hint too much for you guys to think about things, but I've seen Fausto, and I think something interesting to think about is thinking about what's visible and what's invisible, so maybe that could be helpful while you watch both films. Thank you. We'll have a Q&A after, so we'll see you after.
Yeah, Q&A after, and as always, drinks afterwards in the Bell Blue Room. Yeah. So to start, any questions from the audience? I've got a few of my own, but open it up right away if any questions. Well, how about to start? Both of your films seem to take legends or mythologies and tie them to a location or landscapes. Wonder if you could each talk about the sort of genesis or when that decision happened.
Yeah, with this project, I had in mind to make an adaptation of Faust first. The location was something that came more secondary. I had been invited via my partner to this part of Mexico. Two of the characters you see on screen are actually theater directors from Spain. And he was invited to help them out with a camera. They wanted to sort of thinking of making a first film, which they didn't end up making. And then I was sort of decided to, I was invited to come along and decided to make this adaptation there. And then when I, again, knew the space I was going to make the adaptation, then I started sort of to think about, what were the nexus points that I wanted to think about between Faust and between this location.
So for me, it was kind of the opposite in a way. Unintentionally, I've been using the Super 8 camera that my partner gave me to a while ago when I finished undergrad, and I had no community and no equipment. So I was using the Super 8 to kind of keep me practicing, and then I started using the Super 8 to sort of document these different spaces that happen to be touristic spaces. So when I was in Colombia 2-3 years ago, Lake Guatavita is one of these places. When I was in high school, I mean, of course, it's the legend for El Dorado, and it has a legend weight. And when we all grow up, at least in Colombia, we grew up with this very mixed education about the history of our land and the people that were in this land before us and who we are, and we don't really know who we are. But I knew Guatavita because they would take us there, and we would smoke joints, and we would have a fun time, and it was this really mesmerizing place. So because I had been doing this sort of studies of touristic spaces with my Super 8 camera in different places like Vienna and Paris, I brought the Super 8 to this lake. And what I was trying to do, I was trying to figure out a way to see what the camera could see and what the material of Super 8 could see about this space through contrast and texture that could maybe give me an indication about the layers of history of this place. So when you're shooting on film too, you're always kind of trying to figure out what you see and what you can't see, because sometimes what you see the camera won't see. So I was kind of interested in the parallels between what's visible and invisible, which I think has to do with the idea of legends, because I think landscapes hold all these layers of history, and when you're looking at something, you're always trying to deal with what you see, but seeing is not as easy as it looks. So I think you're always trying to figure out what it is that you see that it's visible, and what you see that it's invisible, and what's visible. Mine was longer.
Yeah, building on that, both of you, both your films look incredible, and the way you work with the image and film adds a really interesting level. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that and the cameras you used in your process. And yeah, I know you shot with a camera that was very good at shooting at night and sort of embracing that. And then Lina, your film has amber color. Also, I guess you could say gold. Maybe that's too direct of a connection with El Dorado. But yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about it.
Yeah, so for me, it's interesting because the Super 8 camera that I've used I use it as a way to sort of keep practicing and keep trying to, as I was saying, the difference between looking and seeing. I'm always interested in that difference in my practice, and how when you look at something, it's one thing, but I think sometimes the camera invites us to see something, and it just invites a different kind of concentration or focus. So I shot 2 rolls of Super 8, and what I tried to do is just to bring 2 rolls and allow for the format and the length of what I have to dictate what I can do with it, and I don't necessarily have an intention to make a film. So because with Super 8 is the range of what you can see, it's very short, so like most of the time the light meter in the camera would tell me that what I'm shooting it's not visible, but I would shoot it anyway. So I was always trying to kind of like push those boundaries about like what can I see where the camera tells me that I can't not see any longer. And the color, I mean, it's the beauty of shooting in film that you don't really know what you're getting. So I can see something, but sometimes the chemicals and the material of film gives you something that it's actually different from what you're seeing. So the sort of like the incandescence of the film is something that I didn't necessarily plan for, and it just happened through the process. And I wanted to finish the film on 35 originally, but then when I did some transfers, it changed it. So that's why I decided to go. So I ended up transferring from Super 8 to digital because I felt that it was, I mean, it's not about fidelity or truth, but I just felt that it was a more direct transfer because the 35 was adding different things that I felt that maybe didn't belong to that transaction.
I think Lina and I share definitely the same kind of overlap of the seen and the unseen, but obviously our camera choices were quite different. So I used the Sony A7S to shoot this movie. For those of you who know, and those who don't know, has like a kind of an incredible capacity to shoot in low lighting, with this, you know, high ISO. And that kind of was the sort of impetus of this project. So I got given that camera as a gift. I was sort of playing around with the camera and thinking a bit, you know, sort of how, you know, there's this supernatural aspect to this technology, right? Because it sort of elasticizes, you know, our physical capabilities. You know, we can see more than we should be seeing, right, with this type of technology. And at the time I was teaching a class on art and moving images, and one of the weeks I was teaching covered theater and moving image, and I covered the work of the Worcester Group in relation to Gertrude Stein's Dr. Faustus Lights the Lights. And in that rendition of Faust, or that adaptation, Faust sells his soul for electric light. And it's very much about, you know, this idea that if Faust can see more, he can experience more, and then he understands more of the universe and everything around him. But in Gertrude Stein's work, that's not the case, just because, you know, he has more visibility. He's still sort of left stumbling in the dark, right? Lacking connection and communication to others. So that's kind of the reason why I ended up taking up Faust, was to look at these questions of perception and technology. But then transferred to 16 because I more wanted to create an aesthetic tension that was there. You know, between, again, the visible, the invisible, but also I liked the idea that, you know, it does create a very, you know, kind of nice atmosphere, I should say, for the film. But I also like the fact that if it lets out hints that it's not quite right, you know, like the 16 transfer, because it was shot originally on digital. Like I've had some cinematographers come up to me and say, oh yeah, you know, there's some weird things going on with the shutter. And that couldn't happen with a 16 camera, right? Because it can only happen with the digital and then transferred back and forth. So again, it leaves this sort of uneasy tension, which I think plays in the whole film.
Any questions? Yes.
Wait.
We've got a, hold on. Thanks, Sean.
Hi. I'm really interested in the audio that you used that was in the film, and I'm wondering how much of the audio, because it's overlapped onto images, so it's not it's kind of added after in the editing process. So I'm wondering how much of it was organic and how much of it was scripted beforehand.
So the voiceover or the soundscape, are you saying?
The soundscape. So when we see the characters, but we don't hear them we don't actually hear their audio. We hear a different audio.
So basically what I ended up doing is I ended up pulling a lot of the soundscape off, even like the diegetic sound of nature, right? So you might hear a wave, but that's not necessarily the sound that came with the wave. Part of that was to allow me to control punctuation of sounds. So like when you can hear something obviously very loud, not just in terms of volume, or when I wanted to draw attention to, say, a movement of the water that you couldn't hear in the original soundtrack, and then pulling away the dialogue and stuff just had to come with sort of, you know, narrative choices like throughout.
Yeah, there's some interesting moments. Sometimes it almost sounds like the waves are overwhelming the conversation. And then there's another part, I didn't notice it the first time I saw the film, but it almost seems like one of the characters is ADR'd, that he's talking and then his voice comes in a very dramatic function. So building on that, I wonder how much was sculpted in post and how much was sort of, or I mean, just in general, these descriptions that we hear, and how many were sort of impromptu from people you met, or how many were written before?
Yeah, so I this film, and I've had a few Q&As. There was a bit of a misconception I realized, is that a lot of people think that a lot of the stories were gathered, but it's mostly fiction. So when I was going to this part of Mexico, and I've been to Mexico many times, but I hadn't been to this place in specific where this film was shot. And I knew I wanted to do a Faust adaptation. I had this camera. I had no money. And it was like, okay, so what can I do? Like, these are my obstructions. And so I thought, okay, how can I at least, like, what formal things can I set up now? Maybe they won't work. Maybe they will work, but what can I do before I get there? And so I came up with the interview structures, at least, to say, okay, I really like this kind of storytelling. It reminds me of the way, stories like Faust get told. Many people actually haven't read Faust, but seem to know a lot about Faust or have the basic understanding of Faust. So I had the interview structures, and then, came up with the different stories. Some of them, for example, one is the famous story of Columbus. One is actually a retelling of Marlowe's Faust. One is a story I knew Julia from before, the only woman you see on screen, who's actually not from that part of Mexico. And I had heard a version of a story, and I said, oh, can you tell me that story again, but change these aspects again, because I thought I could tie it in terms of theme and adaptation later. So they were all scripted except the interview of James, the older man on the beach, who is somebody I met there. I mean, all the people except for Julia are people that I met there, and kind of just said, you want to make this movie with me? And sort of roped them into playing different parts. And then I knew I would have a voiceover, because I knew I wanted the voiceover. I knew I wanted to engage with the sort of Faust relationship to nature, especially in relation to technology. But I didn't have all the stories. So I had written some, but then I was there, I would experience different things, and those, what I would experience would turn into parts of the stories, and sort of vice versa. And then I would take stories out when I would edit and go back and forth.
Thanks. I had a similar question about your film, Lina. The voice. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that, about how it came about, and whose voice is that?
So when I decided to go back to this lake where I had spent some time when I was in in high school, I had a friend who did sound for my second film, and because it was a very casual thing, and as I was saying, like, sometimes when I make these films, I'm not really trying to make a film, I'm just trying to gather footage for no other purpose. So then when I went, I called my friend Camilo, who's a sound recordist, who did sound recording for my second feature. And I was in Bogota, and I was like, hey, can we hang out? So it was like an opportunity for us to hang out and shoot some sound. So I said, and because he's worked with me before, he knows that although I have an intention, I'm not going to tell him exactly what to do. So I just said, like, we're just going to go, and you're just going to record whatever sound you want. So he recorded sound, but of course he logged the sound. So when I came back to Toronto and I was looking, so I shot 2 rolls of Super 8, and I used about 85% of the footage in the film. I mean, if I didn't have a film, I wouldn't have a film, but I was trying to look at the footage to see if I had a film. And when I tried to find the movements and tried to see what I had, and I thought about sound, and actually all of my experimental films have been silent. It was the first time that I had sound. I thought, well, I'm obviously a tourist, although I'm Colombian, I'm obviously a tourist in this place, because I don't... I mean, there's a legend of this place, and I read about it, and it was taught to me in school, and it's very complicated. And although there's other foreign tourists, I'm still a tourist. So I felt that logging Camilo's voice saying, like, this is what we're doing was an interesting way to think about how I am trying to see this place. And I think the film for me is my attempt to try to see what I can see. And as I said, seeing is not that easy. So I'm trying to see what's intelligible, what's visible, what's in the dark. So I think the voice seemed like the most obvious marker to kind of establish a presence. Although it was not my presence because I was not doing sound, so he did sound separately and I did image separately, but it was the way to marry the image and sound and to establish both of our presences in this kind of attempt to guess or track or map this landscape and the history.
I think we have time for one more question. Anyone else? Well, Andrea, back to your film. Again, everyone feels like they have an idea of what Faust is. And But I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more about, the second chapter or the sequences set on the coast. I think some people are kind of confused about those connections. And also if you can just talk a little bit about the theme of post-colonialism in your work.
Sure. So, I mean, there is actually a Faustian thread, like narrative thread in the film. So when I was thinking of that adaptation, other than sort of thematic themes that I wanted to use, I decided to take the thread of the second part of Goethe's Faust in Book 2. Right before Faust dies, sort of the act before he dies, Faust is given a strip of the coastline by the emperor. And that's because the devil, Mephistopheles in this case, introduces the credit system to an emperor. And so no longer does he have to dig gold and jewels from the ground to get what he wants in terms of a monetary system, but now we can work on credit. And so because of that, the emperor rewards Faust with this coastline. And at this point in Goethe's work, Faust has done everything, right? He's fallen in love. His lover has died. He's brought, ghosts back from the dead. He has gone on all these kind of wild adventures with witches. And he's got this strip of the coastline, and he's kind of like, what am I going to do, right? So he decides to engage in piracy. He decides that he's going to master nature and landscape by, creating an industrialized city, basically, on that coastline. And so I took that as the sort of thread where you see them, so you hear parts of that there. And for me, that, again, was one of the themes in terms of the devil's relation to capital and colonialism that played into this film. Obviously, because the film was in Mexico, I didn't want to ignore its sort of colonial history, and that's also where a lot of the stories come, again, to bear on the same ideas. Like the story Julia tells, for me, when I first heard a version of that story, it reminded me many of the stories in the work of the anthropologist Michael Taussig, who writes about the sort of devil and commodity fetishism in Colombia, actually, mainly. But these sort of, he talks about how in Latin America and how in Africa and post-colonialism, a lot of issues around money ended up being issues around the devil, right? So if you get rich quick, it's because you've been dealing with the devil. And so that kind of language floats around. So I thought I could, again, tie these kind of colonial issues and these kind of, the after effects psychologically of colonialism with these Faustian connections.
Okay, one last question. Just to sort of wrap things up for both of you. I couldn't help but think of it when I watched the credits for your film just now, Andy, seeing so many names of Canadian filmmakers, Antoine Bourge, Lou Lee, Zahid, Nicholas Preda. You're both Canadian filmmakers, both have lived in Toronto for a time, but have made a lot of your films elsewhere. I'm just curious how you guys see yourselves as Canadian. Do you feel connected to these other filmmakers in a way? And also, if you don't really want to answer that, just what are you working on next, and what country will you be shooting it in?
No, I mean, of course, it's a strange question. And it's not a strange question, Like, of course, on some level, I don't know what exactly it means. Do I feel Canadian? Sure, because I grew up here. I know Lina's an immigrant, but at the same time, I'm my parents are immigrants too. So, and I think that's also the very sort of Canadian story is embedded in immigration of all types or exile. And so I feel very attached to Canada. I haven't lived here in a number of years, but I'm still drawn back to it in a way. Although, obviously, and I think you would know this, when you've lived somewhere else for a long time and then you come back, there's also a lot of distances created between those spaces, and you feel like you're part of it and you feel like you're not part of it at the same time. But in terms of community, I mean, a lot of those Canadian filmmakers are friends of mine since I was like in my early 20s, and so we kind of all grew up together in a way, in terms of in career, but also as people. So, I mean, of course, I feel very connected to, a certain group of Canadian filmmakers. That Lina is also part of this, as we all went to the same school. Kaz, you went to the same school with us. Do I actually want to do next project or just pass it to you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, next project. And I know Lina's writing a script right now, too. So
yeah, I finally have funding. So that was kind of amazing because this movie cost me, I paid for it myself and it didn't cost me very much money. But I'm writing a script actually to shoot in Toronto. and it's going to be fiction, which I don't normally veer into total fiction like that, but I'm doing that. And then I have another project that I'm shooting right now that's shot between Mexico and the southern United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I've been in Canada 20 years, I think. And when I think about if I'm Canadian, I have a Canadian passport now. If I'm a Canadian filmmaker, I guess I don't feel like officially a Canadian filmmaker until I probably make a film in Canada in English, and maybe that will help me, like, baptize me or something. So I feel like outside of that, but I feel kind of in between too, because I made my films in Colombia. I mean, this one too. My short experimental films have been in Paris and Vienna, so I feel kind of constantly in between. Perhaps that's the nature of being an immigrant. I think you're sort of like schizophrenic. You're kind of like here and somewhere else, constantly being like feeling like you're belonging and you're not belonging. It's like you're like a ghost. So it's a strange thing. So I would say, to say it shortly, I do not feel like a Canadian filmmaker. I don't know why, but I don't feel like a Colombian filmmaker either. So I think I'm just in between, but I think it's just the nature of being an immigrant. But I will make, I'm writing a film in English and Spanish in Toronto, so maybe that'll make me a Canadian filmmaker, so we'll see. Maybe I'll get some Canadian money. Actually, I've gotten Arts Council money to make my films, so I shouldn't be ungrateful because of this money is how I've been able to make my films. But maybe I'll get like grown-up industry money to make my films. And in terms of next projects, I'm making a film that is very much about the in-betweenness of how I feel, but it's about my dad's family. It's my project for my MFA right now, and I'm writing a feature, as I said, that it's hopefully going to be in Spanish and English in Toronto with some scenes in Buffalo, and it's about a Colombian mother and daughter. In my fiction, I have like fiction and experimental practices. In my fiction life, I've been sort of like looking at mother and daughter's relationships unintentionally, but it's going to be a mother and daughter relationship as well. So, yeah. And thanks, Cass, so much for having us.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. Please join me thanking Andy and Lina. And then, as always, just down the hall, join us for a drink in the Bell Blue Room.